Hello, magical experimenters, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to talk about working with spirits and about the imagination. And, this is prompted by a recent conversation on my Facebook group page, but it's also prompted by some ongoing on some ongoing classwork that's occurring in my Patreon, where we're actually focusing on cultivating psychic senses and how to use that to connect with spirits. So that's kind of where this comes from. And if you're interested in that class, you can check out the Patreon link, which is like the third link down in the show notes here. So the first thing I want to note too is if you're a frequent flyer to this particular channel, go ahead and like this video and comment on it. If you're new here, please feel free to subscribe and make sure you click the bell notification so that way you get more videos. So I think it's interesting when people inevitably ask, how do I know if I've connected with a spirit for real? And a lot of this is because I think a lot people get fixated or caught up on this notion of how a spirit ought to appear or connect with you. A lot of times people are going in with the seeing is believing mentality, like the show me aspect, like I want a spirit to physically appear before me. And they get disappointed when that doesn't happen all the time. I will tell you that I have never had a spirit physically appear before me. I don't know if I ever will. But my third eye, so to speak, is not where my sharpest psychic senses are. I actually find that if we're just boiling it down to five senses, it's the sense of hearing and tactile sense. Although I would throw into that kinesthetic awareness, which is a little different from tactile. I don't go with the strict five sense model because really there's a lot more senses than that. I mean, there's temperature, there's other things along those lines. But I would say that my psychic senses tend to be driven more toward hearing and tactile awareness or kinesthetic awareness than sight oriented. So I think it's interesting because, some people will say, well, I want a spirit to appear before me. And I'm kind of like, why? And part of that, I think, is a lot of cultural baggage we have around this notion of what objective reality is and how we prove something to be real, that seeing somehow makes it more real, even though sight is just another form of subjective experience. So my own thought around that really is like you can't really even fully rely upon your senses because ultimately at the end of the day they're not objective. They're subjective experiences that you have. Now, if you can, maybe, I don't know, if you get 10 people and you show them the same thing and you say, hey, do you see that? Maybe that'll give you a sense of objective reality. But even then, what you're probably going to hear is, person X saw this, person Y saw that, person Z saw this, et cetera, et cetera. So there's really a lot of baggage around this notion of how you should expect to encounter a spirit. And I think that it ultimately hurts the ability to connect with spirits when we get this notion as to what an experience ought to be like as it applies to spirit work. That's not really my own experience around spirits, I'll put it that way. The other thing that I find is interesting a lot of times is that people who get caught up in this notion of wanting to see spirits, they somehow feel like if they saw spirits, it would somehow show that they were more spiritual. And I don't agree with that notion at all. I think that seeing a spirit does not make you more spiritual. It's just like anything else. You're still a human being. You still have your own issues, etc. Seeing a spirit what does it really do? Maybe if you see a spirit, it actually forces you to question your sanity a bit. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you want to go with that. For me, though, I'd say my most powerful experience when it comes to spirits is really around the imagination. Now, when we use the word imagination, that also has some loaded cultural baggage because most of the time when people think of imagination, they think of a child's imagination. Oh, well, and let's be honest here, kids will talk about their invisible friends, the friends that they connect with. The interesting thing is that a child's imagination is one of the most powerful tools, and we look down upon it. Yet that is the imagination in general is how we conceive of the world. It's how we come up with our best creative ideas and things like that. So I think it's really important to actually embrace your imagination and embrace a childlike sense of wonder around your imagination, because your imagination can allow you to experience things that you otherwise would miss out on. And people who who bash the imagination, or who treat it as something that is questionable, are really missing out on a powerful magical tool, because our imagination allows us to connect to the world around us in ways that we solely wouldn't if we had no imagination. I mean, I would argue that the imagination is really one of the things that distinguishes us from other life. Uh, I don't know if other types of animals can imagine. They may have imagination. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna presume to know one way or another. But what I do know is that people definitely have imagination, because it's something that we talk about all the time, and we see it. We see it in the books that are written. We see it in the art that's created. We see it in the TV shows and movies and video games and all these other different things. And if we didn't have imagination, we'd have none of those things. We wouldn't have the modern technology that we have. Somebody had to dream that up and think of it and imagine it, and that's not something that just occurred. It's something that someone came up with. They imagined it. So imagination is a very powerful experience, and yet people will look down upon it and treat it as something that isn't. Something to be looked down upon, because, well, it's like it's what children come up with. Children came up with. The imagination is something for children, but the imagination is for all of us, and we shouldn't look down on a child's imagination, because sometimes a child's imagination is something creates something very beautiful or terrible in the world. But we shouldn't look down on our own imagination either. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, Taylor, how does this all connect with spirit work? Well, I think it takes imagination in order to really connect with spirits, because the spirits, in a very real sense, don't dwell in our world in quite the way that we do. I'm not saying they don't exist here, because I think they do. I think that they exist in a different way than what we're used to. And that what we try to do a lot of times is we try to impose our way, our perspective, our experiences onto the spirits, and try to get them to show up in a way that's convenient for us. And whether that's appearing in a form that we can relate to, or whether it's expecting them to talk in our native language or whatever else, these things get built into the magical work. And a lot of times, what ends up happening is that we are essentially filtering the spirits. We're filtering them, and we're getting them to appear a certain way. But in that process of filtering them, we're stripping away some of the more powerful aspects of the experience that could be encountered. And this is where the imagination comes into play, because with the imagination, what we can do is we can invite the spirits to connect with us in a way that's maybe a bit more on their level and less on our level, and actually opens the door to experiencing them in a very genuine and authentic manner that actually builds relationship and allows us to connect with them in a way that makes it easier for us to really powerfully work with them, because we're not filtering them out. We're not sanitizing them. We're not making them into something that's convenient for us. Instead, we're encountering them in a way that actually allows them to show up in a way that in a form that might be more preferable for them. And at the same time, someone will say to me, hey, Taylor, why don't you, how do you even prove that the experience you're having in the imagination is really spirit? How do I know it's not just my imagination? And this goes back to that cultural baggage, because again, people were like, well, if it's just my imagination, it's not real. Well, the imagination is real. The imagination is another form of reality. The imagination is another form of consciousness. It's a deeper level of consciousness. It's allowing us to connect with the superconsciousness of the universe, with the superconsciousness of the imaginal. So instead of denigrating it and treating it as something that is less real than what it is, why don't we instead open ourselves to the notion that if anything, the imagination is a gateway, a portal to connecting with the spirits, and that we can actually do that using the imagination. Okay, Taylor, fine, but it's the imagination. How do I know it's real? Again, this is the circular thing. Here's my thought on this. You can never know for sure what is real or not real, because to one extent or another, reality is a subjective experience. I can. You're watching this video right now, and so you're connecting with me. But is it real? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Uh, what might make it more real is that it's very conveniently based in a physical reality that you can connect with. That's maybe a little bit easier, but still, you're still relying upon your senses in order to watch this video and hear me. And and it's not as objective as you might think it is. For example, you're looking at this robe that I'm wearing right now. I can tell you that this is a yellowish gold color and a blue color here, but you might see it as a different color. And that's how subjective our senses can be. So when we look at that, we have to recognize that imagination is to some degree subjective as well. So then how do we distinguish from that subjectivity? How do we determine if the connection with the spirit is real? Well, I mean, first off, I say look at how the spirit is showing up in your life. If you're working with that spirit consistently, is the spirit showing up consistently in a manner that seems to be relevant to what that spirit actually is and what it does and how it interacts with you and the world around you? If it's a one-time event, there's really no way for you to prove that the spirit contact that you've had is real. You have to basically continue to choose to work with the spirit over a period of time. And you say, okay, great, that's fine, Taylor, but what if it gets to the point where I'm thinking, oh, the voices in my head are making me do something? Well, that's where maybe you get some professional help, first of all. But second, really look at the things that are being requested. Are they things that you would want to do? Are they things that are in line with your own agenda? Are they things that seem to align with the spirit's agenda? Are they things that you are ethically comfortable with doing? At the end of the day, discernment is not about how real something is. Discernment is about your own compass, your own guide, and what you are willing to do, what you are willing to accept, and what really matters to you. And that should be your guide. And if it's not your guide, then that in of itself is something I would encourage you to cultivate. Let's not just look toward a very specific notion of objective reality to prove that something is real. Let's also use our own best judgment to decide if something is real or not real. Let's use our awareness around a given possibility of something and saying, is this a possibility I want to manifest? Is this a possibility I can ethically get behind? Is this a possibility that makes sense to me? Are these actions something where I'm comfortable dealing with the consequences? Let's use that filter as well. And I think a lot of times, when people get caught up in this notion of spirit work, they get caught up in is this real or not real? But part of reality involves using your own best judgment, your own awareness, your emotional awareness, your mental awareness, your spiritual awareness. These are things that you ideally are cultivating over time and cultivating through each work that you do. If you're not cultivating them, then this is where you are missing out on something significant in your spiritual practice. And this is why with the imagination, if we use the imagination as a means to connect with spirit, what we end up discovering is that it really just allows us to hone in on the nature of that spirit in relationship to ourselves. And then we can make that value judgment as to whether or not we want to continue to work with that spirit. If you question the reality of that spirit, which certainly nothing wrong with doing that, ask yourself, why are you questioning it? What are you specifically questioning? Is it the objective reality, or is it something else about the spirit? And there are no right or wrong answers here. But I think that if we are only focused on the objective notion of a spirit, what we are missing out on categorically are other levels of discernment that we should be employing in our magical work and really in our lives in general. Uh, that teaches us how to be aware of the potential consequences of things and how to be aware of the reality of our choices and all the other things that are important and relative to this kind of work. When I consider the approach of the imagination, I really think of the imagination as being this thing that lets us conceive of the impossible, that lets us consider potentiality, that lets us consider things outside of what is right in front of us. And that's why we should cultivate it and work with it when it comes to spirit work, and why we should cultivate it and work with it in general within our lives. Because if we only get caught up in what we think is real, we'll never open ourselves to the possibility that reality might be a very limited thing and that there may be other aspects of reality that we're completely missing out on. And that's where imagination comes into play. It opens the book. It opens the reality for us. Gail says, as a social worker of many years, hearing spirits, mediumship, channeling are extremely different from the psychiatric voices, which are extremely different, commanding against your personal ethics. Well, yeah, that's a good point too, Gail. And that's really a good way to discern it. Like, really look at look at look at what is actually happening. If there's genuine connection with the spirit, you're gonna get a sense of difference and distinction that is different from the quote unquote voices in your head. Um, I think it's fair to say that, like, I know when I've connected with a spirit because I know that spirit is not me, and there is a very distinct difference between the experience of the spirit. And even though I'm experiencing that spirit in the imagination and in the sensory experiences that I may have that accompany that, I'm still very much learning about that spirit through the interactions that are occurring there. And I think that, again, we can have this experience with the spirits where we really open ourselves up to it through the imagination, because we allow the imagination to show us what we would otherwise be missing out on. So that's my thoughts around imagination and spirit. And I would challenge you, especially if you're one of those people who's kind of like, well, how do I know for sure that if I've connected with the spirit using the imagination? The best way to find out is to test what you're doing. Work with that spirit for a while. Journal about what you're doing, and really apply some perspective and awareness around what you're trying to do with the spirit, and how you're forming a relationship with the spirit. That's a key thing too. Like, really think about the relationship you're trying to form. Are you coming in expecting the spirit to do stuff for you? Are you coming in and commanding it? All these other things. Or are you coming in trying to build a collaborative relationship? I prefer a collaborative relationship myself. I've always gotten better results. So, oh, okay. Here's this person. Hello. Could be many books as wealth magic be a kind of reward or paid to the spirits of these books, a kind of payment, publicity? I don't know exactly what you're trying to ask. So you're basically asking, like, if you can, if there's a way to reward spirits through, like, the books that you're reading or through the wealth or whatever. The way that I reward spirits is really, I don't even do like an award thing. What I really do is I really come up with a consensual model where the spirits and I are basically agreeing upon what we're willing to do with each other, how we're willing to connect with each other. So for example, with the goetic demons, a lot of times what I'll end up doing is I'll create art for those demons, and I'll write about those demons and how I work with them. Other people might work with the demons in another way, and that's perfectly okay. I think it really kind of again comes right down to how do you establish a collaborative relationship with the spirits, and that kind of relationship isn't something that should be done casually. If you're going to work with a spirit, really commit to working with that spirit. But I think whatever agreement you come up with, you want to make sure you're honoring it, just as you want to make sure the spirit is honoring its end of your agreement. And at the same time, I don't think that just taking a transactional approach is the best way to do these things. When I look at my relationship with the spirits, a sure sign of maturity with that relationship is how that connection evolves past um, the the transactional model. So, like for example, if I'm working with like the goetic demon of Person, sure, I've created a painting for him, I've written about him, all that other stuff. But what I've also done is I've developed an ongoing relationship with Person where he and I continually work together. And it isn't always about publicity or other things. It's really about just doing this deeper work because there's this genuine love of the work and that we encounter that with each other. And I think that's a really important thing that people forget about in regards to spirits and really just in general, that sometimes you do stuff for the genuine love of it, not because you want to get something out of it per se, but because you genuinely want to see where you can take things. And there's a love there for it. So that's also worthwhile. I don't think that the book itself is a part of a payment. I would disagree with that notion. Like you buying a book, for example, to work with the spirits in that book is not payment to the spirits. It might be payment to the people who wrote the book. Now, someone writing a book could be a form of payment. I wrote the book Magic by Design, and I thanked the spirit of the Archangel of Camiel because he very much downloaded that idea to me, what the concepts in that book, and so it was kind of an honoring of him in writing that book. But I would still say that, I would still do stuff outside of just writing the book to thank a spirit if you're going to thank one. Again, this is about building a relationship, and that's where the discernment comes into play. All right, thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.